Pre-registered coordinates. Drone surveillance. No escape route. This wasn't a logistics operation. This was an execution. The Russian rail marshalling yard on the southern approach to occupied territory had been functioning as a critical artery for months. Ammunition trains, fuel wagons, armored vehicle transporters, all passing through a single choke point that Russian planners believed was beyond reach. Protected by layered air defense. Protected by distance. Protected by the simple arithmetic of kilometers between the front and the rear. They were wrong about all of it. Welcome to EastAlert. I'm your host, and tonight we're breaking down one of the most consequential deep strike operations of this phase of the conflict. A Ukrainian long-range drone raid that reached into the Russian rear and found exactly what the strike planners were looking for: a fuel train, a wagon of tank shells, a marshalling yard full of the equipment that kept Russian armor moving south toward the contact line. What happens when you hit all three at once? We're about to find out. To understand why this strike mattered, you need to understand the geography of Russian logistics in the southern military district. The rail network feeding the occupied territories runs through a series of marshalling yards where trains are broken apart, reassembled, and dispatched toward the front in organized convoys. These yards are not just stations. They are the circulatory system of the entire Russian war machine in the south. Remove them, even temporarily, and the flow of ammunition, fuel, and equipment slows to a trickle. Ukrainian military planners had been studying this system for a long time. OSINT analysts mapped the rail corridors. Satellite imagery tracked train movements. Signal intelligence identified the scheduling patterns. When the heavy ammunition convoys moved, when the fuel trains arrived, when the marshalling yards were at maximum capacity. The picture that emerged was detailed enough to identify the optimal strike window. The moment when the greatest concentration of high-value cargo would be sitting stationary in the one place where a precision strike could destroy all of it simultaneously. That window does not stay open long. The planning cycle for a long-range drone operation of this complexity runs for weeks. Ukrainian operators don't simply point a drone at a target and launch. They build a three-dimensional picture of the air defense environment along the entire route. They identify radar coverage gaps. They model the terrain to find approach corridors that allow low-altitude flight. Below the detection threshold of the air defense systems, the Russians have deployed to protect their rear areas. This is the part that Russian planners consistently underestimate. They think in terms of range. They calculate whether Ukrainian drones can physically reach a target at a given distance. What they don't adequately account for is the sophistication of the routing analysis that happens before a single drone ever leaves the ground. The drones that struck the marshalling yard did not fly in a straight line. They flew routes modeled against the known positions of Russian air defense assets. S-300 batteries, Pantsir S-1 systems, and the network of radar installations forming the outer ring of protection for the southern military district's rear area infrastructure. Each route was calculated to minimize radar cross-section exposure time. Each waypoint was chosen to exploit a specific gap in coverage. Russian defenders were watching for threats coming from the northwest, from the directions where Ukrainian strike capability had previously demonstrated reach. The drones came in on different axes. Which weapon was deadlier in this operation? A. The long-range drone systems used in the initial strike. B. The secondary explosions from the ammunition wagons. C. The fire that spread through the fuel storage area afterward. Comment below with your answer. The marshalling yard itself was a specific type of infrastructure that Russian logisticians prize. Not simply a train station, but a classification yard. A facility with multiple parallel tracks where incoming trains are broken into their component wagons and reassembled into outbound convoys sorted by destination and cargo type. The yard contained locomotive repair facilities, fueling infrastructure, cargo handling equipment, and the specialized loading ramps used to roll armored vehicles onto flatbed transporters. At the moment the Ukrainian operators initiated the final approach sequence, the yard was operating at elevated capacity. A fuel train. 12 tanker wagons carrying diesel fuel for armored vehicles had arrived from the north and was coupled to a flatbed section carrying sealed cargo containers. Ukrainian intelligence analysis would later confirm what those containers held. 152 artillery shells, packaged in standard Russian military shipping configuration, destined for the artillery grouping supporting the contact line operations. The coupling of a fuel train to an ammunition cargo section was not standard procedure. It was an expedient decision made by a yard supervisor trying to clear traffic on the main line. Move the fuel train onto a holding track. Couple it to the waiting ammunition section. Get the main line clear for the next inbound convoy. That decision created a target that Ukrainian planners had theoretically modeled but never expected to find realized so perfectly in practice. Stay with me. What happens in the next 18 minutes destroys the entire southern resupply schedule and triggers a command crisis that reaches all the way to the Southern Military District headquarters. The drone operators monitoring the approach feeds saw the configuration: 12 fuel tankers, coupled ammunition cargo, stationary. In the center of the classification yard, surrounded by infrastructure that would amplify any detonation. The locomotive repair halls, the fuel storage tanks on the eastern edge of the yard, the vehicle loading ramps where 3 flatbed transporters sat loaded with what satellite imagery analysis suggested were T-72 hulls being returned from depot maintenance. The strike lead transmitted a single encrypted message to the planning cell. The word that confirmed the target configuration matched the optimal scenario. The word was green. 12 Ukrainian long-range drones, each carrying a shaped, penetrating warhead designed to maximize damage to rail infrastructure and rolling stock, had been airborne for more than 3 hours at this point. They had flown low, beneath the radar floor that Russian air defense operators were watching. They had navigated waypoints chosen to avoid the overlapping detection zones of the Pantsir systems deployed at 3 positions around the yard's perimeter. One of those Pantsir systems detected something at the outer edge of its radar coverage approximately 4 minutes before impact. The operator flagged the contact and began tracking. The contact signature was intermittent, a function of the drone's low altitude and the terrain masking provided by the ridgeline to the southwest of the yard. The system's engagement algorithm classified it as probable bird return, a classification that automated air defense systems in the Russian inventory have a documented history of generating when tracking small, slow-moving targets in cluttered low-altitude environments. The operator logged the contact, did not engage, moved on. This is the obstacle that nearly unraveled the entire operation. Not the Pantsir. Not the S-300 battery positioned 12 kilometers to the north. What nearly stopped the strike was something the Ukrainian planners had not fully accounted for in their route modeling. A temporary electronic warfare deployment that Russian forces had positioned at a relay station approximately 30 kilometers along the primary approach corridor. The EW system was not on any of the existing target databases. It had been moved into position as part of a rotational redeployment cycle, a standard Russian military procedure for keeping mobile EW assets from establishing predictable patterns. The system began jamming a frequency band that 2 of the Ukrainian drones used for navigation correction updates. Both drones lost their corrected waypoint data simultaneously. Their onboard systems defaulted to last known position data and inertial navigation. In the open terrain of the approach corridor, with no terrain features to provide reference points for optical navigation systems, the 2 drones began drifting from their programmed routes. The ground control station detected the anomaly within 90 seconds. The operators had a decision to make: break radio silence and attempt to transmit corrected navigation data, risking detection by the same EW system that had caused the problem, or allow the 2 drones to continue on degraded navigation, accepting that they might not reach their designated aim points within the yard. They chose a third option. The 2 affected drones were redirected to a secondary target, a power substation serving the yard's switching equipment, using a frequency band that the Russian EW system was not currently jamming. The navigation correction went through. The drones accepted new waypoints. The remaining 10 continued on their original routes, unaffected. The yard's switching substation was a target of opportunity. Take it out, and the entire yard's ability to route trains between tracks is eliminated. The Russian yard operators would lose automated control of the classification system. Everything would have to be done manually, a process that takes 3 to 4 times as long, creating a secondary bottleneck that would compound the damage of the primary strike. The 10 drones on their original routes reached the outer perimeter of the marshalling yard at low altitude, flying between the rail lines of the main approach track. The Pantsir operator who had logged the earlier contact was still watching the spot where he had last tracked it. The drones came in from a different vector entirely. How many rail wagons did Ukrainian forces destroy or damage in this strike? A 23B-38 C-50? Hold that answer. We'll come back to it at the end. The first drone impacted the junction point between the fuel train's lead tanker and the coupled ammunition section. The penetrating warhead functioned exactly as designed, punching through the outer shell of the tanker before the main charge detonated inside the fuel storage compartment. the diesel fuel flash ignited. A rolling wall of flame expanded outward from the lead tanker, engulfing the coupling mechanism, the first two ammunition cargo containers on the adjacent flatbed section, and the locomotive that had been sitting coupled to the north end of the fuel train, waiting for the track clearance signal that would never come. The locomotive engineer had gone to the station building 20 minutes earlier to file his movement documentation. He survived. The two men in the cab of the adjacent shunting locomotive did not. Secondary detonations began within seconds of the initial strike. The ammunition containers on the flatbed section were military-grade packaging, designed to survive rough handling and transportation vibration, not to resist the heat output of burning diesel fuel at close range. The standard packaging for 152 mm artillery shells uses a sealed metal container with an internal temperature tolerance that is exceeded when exposed to sustained fire above approximately 400 degrees Celsius. The fuel fire was generating temperatures exceeding 800 degrees at the point of maximum combustion. The first ammunition container detonated approximately 40 seconds after the initial drone impact. Subscribe to EastAlert if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because what happens next is a textbook example of why rear area infrastructure security matters as much as frontline defense. The secondary detonation of the ammunition container was not a single explosion. It was a chain reaction. Propellant charges from the artillery shells began cooking off in sequence as the heat propagated through the stack. Each detonation sent fragments outward at velocities sufficient to penetrate the sidewalls of adjacent rail wagons. The fuel train's remaining tankers, 11 of them, still full, began venting as their pressure relief systems activated in the heat, sending fuel vapor into the expanding fireball above the burning wagons. The Panzer systems operator, watching from his position approximately 800 meters from the yard's perimeter, saw the sky above the classification tracks turn orange. He attempted to engage. His system's radar was looking for incoming threats. It had not been configured to engage outgoing signature sources. By the time the operator manually overrode the engagement parameters to fire on the drones, still completing their attack runs, 3 of his 4 ready missiles had been displaced from their launch orientation by a shockwave from the secondary detonation that knocked the vehicle off its stabilizing jacks. 1 missile launched. It acquired the heat signature of the burning fuel train, not a drone, and impacted in the center of the fireball. 6 more drones completed their attack runs in the next 4 minutes, each striking pre-designated aim points within the marshalling yard. The vehicle loading ramps on the southern end of the facility. The reinforced concrete and steel structures used to roll armored vehicles onto the flatbed transporters received 2 direct impacts. 1 ramp section collapsed entirely. The other was structurally compromised, its hydraulic lifting systems destroyed, the access surface cratered by the penetrating warhead detonation. The 3 flatbed transporters loaded with T-72 hulls took fragmentation damage from the ramp strikes. Ukrainian OSINT analysis of subsequent satellite imagery assessed 2 of the 3 hulls as destroyed by secondary fire and structural collapse. The locomotive repair hull received a single drone impact on the roof section above the main maintenance pit. The penetrating warhead went through 3 meters of reinforced concrete before detonating in the repair bay where 2 locomotives were undergoing scheduled maintenance. Both were assessed as total losses. The maintenance equipment, cranes, hydraulic lifts, diagnostic systems, was destroyed by the internal detonation and the fire that followed. 2 drones struck the fuel storage tanks on the eastern edge of the yard simultaneously. The timing was deliberate. The strikes had been sequenced so that both tanks were hit within approximately 2 seconds of each other, creating a combined fire that overwhelmed the yard's fixed fire suppression systems. Those systems had been designed to address a single-point fire. A simultaneous double strike exceeded their capacity. The fuel storage area burned for 11 hours. Here is what Russian logistics planners had calculated when they designated this yard as a protected rear area facility. The distance from the contact line made direct fire impossible. The air defense network around the yard could detect and engage conventional threats at ranges sufficient to prevent successful strikes. The depth of the rear area created a buffer zone that reduced the threat from shorter-range systems. The classification yard was, by every metric in the standard Russian military rear area security doctrine, safe. What that doctrine did not account for was an adversary that had spent the preceding months systematically mapping every radar coverage gap, every air defense position rotation schedule, every electronic warfare deployment pattern, and every rail traffic scheduling cycle in the entire Southern Military District rear area. It did not account for an adversary willing to send 12 drones on 3-hour approach flights at low altitude through complex terrain to reach a single target at the optimal moment of vulnerability. What would you have done differently if you were the Russian Southern Military District Logistics Commander? Think about that, because the answer reveals everything wrong with their rear area security doctrine. Ukrainian strike methodology in this phase of the conflict reflects a doctrinal evolution that has been building since the beginning of the full-scale phase. Ukrainian forces have essentially built a precision deep strike capability out of systems that individually lack the range and payload of conventional strike aircraft. Long-range drones supplemented by ATACMS ballistic missiles and Storm Shadow cruise missiles have created a layered deep strike architecture that can reach targets at ranges the Russian military's rear area defense planning simply did not account for. The drones used in this operation were not the relatively simple systems that characterized the earliest Ukrainian long-range strike attempts. They were purpose-designed strike platforms with sophisticated navigation systems, electronic countermeasure packages, and warheads designed for specific target types. The payload configuration used against the fuel train incorporated a penetrating stage to defeat the tanker's outer shell and an incendiary secondary charge to maximize the fuel ignition effect. This is Ukraine inventing new ways to fight. At the same time, the primary drones were completing their attack runs on the classification yard. The two redirected drones struck the power substation serving the yard's switching equipment. Both hits were precise. The first drone impacted the main transformer bank. The second struck the backup generator building that housed the emergency power systems. The substation ceased functioning within seconds of the double strike. The electronic switching equipment that controlled the yard's track configuration lost power. Every signal light went dark. Every automated switch locked in its last position. The yard, already in chaos from the explosions in the classification tracks, suddenly had no ability to route trains through the facility, even if there had been anyone in a position to try. Russian emergency response teams arrived at the yard perimeter approximately 12 minutes after the first drone impact. The fire suppression vehicles that came first could not approach the central tracks because the burning ammunition in the flatbed section was still cooking off, producing the characteristic crack-bang detonation sequence that indicates propellant charges going through delayed sympathetic detonation. Anyone in the open within 200 meters of the burning section was in lethal fragmentation range. The emergency response coordinator, according to communications intercepted by Ukrainian signal intelligence, transmitted a situation report to the District Logistics Command that described, in terms that left no room for interpretation, a complete loss of the facility's operational capability. If you believe rear area logistics, security is going to define the next phase of this war, type EastAlert in the comments. The District Logistics Command's response, also intercepted, was a demand to know when the yard would be operational again. The coordinator's answer was not logged in the Ukrainian intelligence summary. But the follow-on communications from the District Command to the Army Group headquarters told the story. The Army Group requested emergency diversion routing for 3 ammunition convoys scheduled to transit the yard over the following 48 hours. The request identified the situation at the facility as a critical logistics disruption requiring immediate higher-level coordination. The Southern Military District Chief of Staff was reportedly notified within 2 hours of the strike. The strategic implications of this kind of disruption extend well beyond the immediate material losses. Russian artillery units along the Donetsk contact line operate on consumption rates that require continuous resupply to maintain sustained fire operations. A disruption in the rail supply chain does not immediately silence the guns. Russian logistics managers have buffer stocks positioned at forward supply points along the contact line. But those buffer stocks are not designed for sustained consumption without resupply. They are designed to absorb the time gaps between train deliveries. When train deliveries stop, the buffers begin depleting. Ukrainian artillery and drone operators along the contact line had been briefed on the timing of the deep strike. In the 24 hours following the marshalling yard attack, Ukrainian counter-battery teams noted a measurable reduction in Russian 152 mm artillery fire intensity along the northern Donetsk axis, the sector served by the logistics corridor running through the struck yard. The reduction was not total. Russian artillery did not go silent, but the rate of fire decreased, and the periods of silence between Russian fire missions extended. Ukrainian positions that had been receiving sustained Russian artillery harassment for weeks experienced a brief respite. Brief, but noticed. The rail network serving the marshalling yard was not permanently destroyed. Rail infrastructure is inherently repairable. The lines themselves are intact, the rolling stock that was not destroyed can be rerouted, and the physical damage to the yard's facilities, while extensive, is restorable over weeks and months rather than permanently lost. This is a fundamental difference between disruption and destruction in the context of logistics interdiction. Russian engineering teams with track repair capability were deployed to assess the facility within 24 hours. The power substation was assessed for emergency restoration. The transformer bank was destroyed, but Russian military logistics management includes pre-positioned transformer units at district-level supply depots for exactly this kind of contingency. Restoration timelines for partial switching capability were estimated at 72 to 96 hours by the assessment teams. The locomotive repair hall and the fuel storage infrastructure would take significantly longer. The structural damage to the hall required engineering assessment before any restoration work could begin. The fuel storage area was still burning. What NATO would have done differently is straightforward in concept and difficult in execution: distributed logistics. NATO doctrine deliberately spreads supply nodes across multiple facilities so that the destruction of any single node does not create a systemic disruption. The Russian military's inherited Soviet logistics doctrine concentrates capacity in large facilities because Soviet-era planning assumed air superiority over the rear area and ground-based air defense capable of defeating conventional air threats. Both assumptions have been invalidated by this phase of the conflict. What would NATO have done differently? Comment your analysis. Because this is not just a Ukrainian strike. It is a case study in how modern precision long-range capability can force a fundamental redesign of rear area security doctrine. The crews of the 3 T-72 hulls that had been loaded on the flatbed transporters were not present at the time of the strike. The vehicles were being transported from depot maintenance without crews, a standard procedure for vehicles undergoing scheduled overhaul. No crew would be assigned until the vehicles arrived at the receiving unit. The maintenance personnel at the locomotive repair hall, approximately 14 workers on the night shift, had a more complex situation. The drone that struck the roof of the repair hall impacted at a location above the secondary maintenance bay, not the main pit where the 2 locomotives were sitting. The detonation inside the building was devastating to the equipment, but the personnel were not uniformly positioned beneath the impact point. Ukrainian intelligence's subsequent assessment, based on Russian emergency services communications, indicated that the strike resulted in multiple casualties in the repair hall, but the specific numbers were not confirmed by independent sources. Russian state media did not report the strike. This is consistent with the pattern of information management that Russian authorities have maintained throughout the full-scale phase of the conflict. Strikes on rear area infrastructure, particularly those that reveal the inability of air defense to protect nominally secure facilities, are systematically not reported or are reported only in forms that minimize the apparent scope of the damage. The official line, when anything was said at all, was that air defense had successfully intercepted Ukrainian drone threats in the southern military district area, and that infrastructure in the region was functioning normally. The satellite imagery that appeared on OSINT monitoring platforms in the days following the strike told a different story. The burned classification tracks, the collapsed ramp section, the destroyed fuel storage area, the blackened shell of the locomotive repair hall. The absence of rail traffic through the facility for the first 5 days following the strike compared to the constant transit activity that had characterized the yard before. Intercepted Russian military communications revealed something that the satellite imagery could not show: the internal acknowledgement among Russian logistics officers that the marshalling yard attack had exposed a real vulnerability in their rear area security architecture. One communication, shared by Ukrainian military intelligence in a sanitized format, quoted a logistics officer as stating that the yard's defense had been planned against a threat model that no longer corresponded to actual Ukrainian capability. That is the lesson. When your threat model does not correspond to reality, your defenses fail. Not because your weapons don't work, not because your soldiers are incompetent, but because you planned for the war you expected and found yourself fighting the one your adversary designed. Ukrainian planners spent months building the threat model for this strike. They mapped every air defense position. They tracked every rail schedule. They modeled every navigation route. They prepared for the EW obstacle and had a contingency response ready to execute within 90 seconds of detecting the jamming. When the obstacle appeared, they solved it. The strike continued. This is the doctrine that Ukraine has built from the experience of this phase of the conflict. Not improvisation. Preparation. Systematic, detailed, patient preparation that transforms the gap between an adversary's expectations and reality into a targeting opportunity. Now for the answer to the quiz. How many rail wagons did Ukraine destroy or damage in this strike? The answer is B-38. The 12 fuel tankers of the fuel train were all destroyed or rendered non-operational by the initial strike and subsequent fire. The flatbed section carrying ammunition cargo contributed approximately 6 wagons. The scattered rolling stock throughout the classification yard. Wagons that had been assembled for outbound convoys and were sitting on the holding tracks when the strike began. Accounted for the remaining damage assessments in the Ukrainian battle damage report, which documented 38 wagons total as destroyed or requiring depot-level repair before return to service. 3 questions worth sitting with. Was the decision to route the fuel train through the classification yard without air cover overhead the right call? The yard's air defense was not designed to provide close protection for specific rail movements. It was a static perimeter defense. The decision to move high-value cargo through a facility that had been under sustained intelligence surveillance was either a failure of threat awareness or an accepted risk that Russian planners had decided was tolerable given the distance from the front. Neither explanation is reassuring. Could Russian air defense have prevented this? With different disposition? Potentially. A mobile Panzer system positioned to cover low-altitude approaches from the southwest. The Vector, the primary drone package used, would have had engagement opportunities. But mobile air defense assets in the southern military district were deployed according to a threat model that prioritized approaches from the north and northwest. Repositioning those assets requires either intelligence indicating the threat is coming from a different direction, or the kind of distributed coverage that the available assets simply could not provide. What would you have done differently as the strike lead? If you had 10 drones on target and 2 going to a secondary, do you redistribute? Accept the degraded navigation? Or redirect all 12 to the primary target and accept that the power substation remains intact? Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. That's what EastAlert is built on. Subscribe to EastAlert. We break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Every operation, every decision, every lesson. This is how modern warfare actually works. The marshalling yard is quieter now. The burned classification tracks have been partially cleared. Some of the infrastructure has been restored, piece by piece, as Russian engineering teams work through the damage assessment. The fuel storage area has been rebuilt, in a different configuration, in a different location within the yard perimeter. But the rail traffic that once moved through this facility without a second thought about air threats now moves differently. The schedules have been changed. The timing of high-value cargo movements has been randomized. Additional air defense assets have been repositioned. New procedures have been implemented. All of it because Ukrainian drone operators followed a pre-registered targeting solution, flew 12 drones on 3-hour routes through terrain-masked corridors, and found a fuel train coupled to an ammunition cargo section at the worst possible moment for Russian logistics. The wrecks were cleared. The lessons were not. In rear area logistics, the target that feels safest is sometimes the one most precisely selected. Stay vigilant.